Okay, so we're going to talk about inversions of the 5 chord and how to part write those. I think we may have done the first inversion of the 5 chord. I can't remember. We'll review that if we did, or go over it for the first time. But of course, the idea, if I were going to part write a 5 chord in the key of C, because the 5 and 5/7 chord are the chords that we're going to look at in inversion today, right? But if I were in the key of C, right, GBD is a 5 chord, and I would assume, right, if it's reposition, G in the bass, okay? And then we would, double, and then have the other notes of the chord spaced somewhere above with the appropriate spacing between soprano, alto, and tenor, and then the appropriate doubling of the bass note here. And that would be an example of the root position, 5 chord. One thing to make sure that we understand is that inverting the chord simply means that the bass note is not the root. So if I had a B in a 5 chord, right, GBD, okay, and I put the B in the bass, then it's in what we call first inversion, okay? And there is a figured bass number that we associate with that, and the way we figure out the figured bass number is we think back to the old Baroque style of improvising harmony, where if you saw a B in the bass and I said to improvise a chord, you would assume that to the B I would add these notes. Yeah, I'd make a triad with the given note as the bass. But if I want, instead of BDF in the key of C, GBD, right, then instead of the F, which I might assume, I'm being asked to substitute the G, which is a 6th above. Does that make sense? The 6th substitutes for the 5th. And that's why we call first inversion, is a chord of the 6th. We are adding the figure bass number 6 because that is the interval structure created by that inversion. And so that we just have to memorize. That a 6 added to a Roman numeral means it is in first inversion, and the 3rd of the chord is in the bass. Okay? And we talked about second inversion in a previous lecture. We've not looked at the second inversion of the 5 chord or the 5/7 yet. That's what we'll do in this lecture. But if I put the D in the bass, right, and I wanted above that a G and a B, what we call second inversion. Again, if I had a D in a bass and I told you to improvise a chord, you would assume a 5th and a 3rd added above, right? But if I wanted a G and a B that are a 6th and a 4th above instead, then I would use the Roman numeral to describe the GBD 5 chord, but the 6/4 to remind us that this is actually in second inversion and the interval structure is a 6 and 4th above the bass as a result instead. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's second inversion. Quickly, we can talk about the 5/7 chords. And of course, when we add 7 to a Roman numeral, we are actually, it's just like this. It's still just, it's all figured bass practice. That again, if I had G as a bass note and I told you to improvise a chord, you would assume GBD, but if I want you to add an F, a 7th above, I have to tell you that. I have to give you the little number to tell you what note is different or being added to the harmony. If I put 5/7 GBDF in first inversion, which would put the B in the bass, again, I would assume BDF, a triad with B as the root, but I want you to add a G to that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, you used to have the 7th above.
But it's not over here when we use the 6th. The idea was that the G, the 6th above, was substituting for the F. Over here, I want the G, but I also want you to keep the F. I want you to keep the F in the 5/7 chord, not substitute the G for the F. Right. Does that make sense? So 5/7 in first inversion with the 3rd, in this case the B in the bass, we refer to it as the 6th that we're adding, but we have to tell you to keep the 5th. You're not just substituting the 6th for the 5th. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's why a 5/7 chord in first inversion takes the figure bass number 6/5, if that makes sense. Got it? Okay. So we can continue along. This was G, B, D, F with B in the bass. We can have G, B, D, F with D in the bass. And again, to figure out that this is a 5/7 chord, but to figure out the figured bass numbers, again, if I had a D, I would assume DFA, but I want G, B, D, F. I want B instead of the A, and then I want G added to this chord, right?
And that's the...
Okay, now, this is where things get a little dicey. That looks like it would be 6/4, right? But the 4 is not substituting for the third as it did here. We are retaining the third. And so this would be a 6/4/3. However, in the case of the 6/4/3, there is a traditional sort of abbreviation that's occurred. We usually don't put the 6. We just put 4/3.
Okay.
Basically, the idea is if you're adding a fourth, it's understood that you're also adding the 6. And when it came to 6/4/3, people got lazy and they just they took off the 6 to make it. So the 6 is understood, but 4/3 is the figured bass number. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then sort of our last third inversion of a 7th chord, if I had G, B, D, F with F in the bass, again, I would assume F, A, C, but I want F, G, B, D, so the D a 6th above, the B a 4th above, and the G a 2nd above are all unexpected and substituting for the other notes we might have expected. So 6/4/2 is a figured bass number, but again,
6/4, get rid of it.
we get rid of the 6 traditionally and just call this 4/2. Does that help? I know that's a little confusing.
No, it's not. It's really
But I think it's important. I think it's important to go through that in discussion and really have a moment to see where those figured bass numbers come from. But most importantly, you just have to memorize. A Roman numeral all by itself, of course, is in root position. A Roman numeral with the 6th added is a triad in first inversion. The third is in the bass. A Roman numeral with the 6/4 is a triad in second inversion, 5th in the bass. Of course, if we add 7 to a Roman numeral, we're adding the 7th, but it's in root position. 6/5 is a 7th chord, 4-note chord in first inversion, 3rd in the bass. Right? 4/3 added to a Roman numeral is a 7th chord in second inversion, 5th in the bass.
Right.
And then the 4/2 added to a Roman numeral is a 7th chord in 3rd inversion, 7th
Is in the bass.
and is in the bass. And so that you just kind of have to memorize, and I've drawn out charts, using the 1/164. I'm sorry, 1/1/6, 1/6/4, and as an example. Of course, it could be any Roman numeral, not just 5/6/5, 5/4/3, 5/4/2. This is root position. This is first inversion. This is second inversion. This is third inversion, which of course there is no third inversion of a triad because there's not 4 notes, right? Okay, and that means the root's in the bass, the third's in the bass, the 5th's in the bass, and the 7th's in the bass. And so I think even in the textbook that I've done, I may have that chart. And ultimately, you just have to commit that to memory, what those figured bass numbers mean. But I'm hoping that going through the discussion, really helps illuminate where they come from and impress upon you. We didn't just come up with these numbers at random. They really do represent the interval structure of the chord created by the inversion, if that makes sense.
I have them pretty well memorized.
Good. And of course, once upon a time, in the Baroque period, 1600, 1750, and even into early classic, there was what was called basso continuo practice, where instrumental music was written this way. The bass line was accompanied by a chord-producing instrument, a lute or a harpsichord, organ in the church, some sort of chord-producing instrument. And that chord producing instrument would double the bass line and improvise chords off that bass line. Okay? What was called basso continuo practice. And the keyboard player literally was improvising the part, that, just making it up on the spot. What they were reading was the written bass line with the figured bass numbers added to let them know what chord they were to create. It's really no different than the lead sheet used in popular music today, where you as a guitarist would improvise chords off a lead sheet, right? Mm-hmm. It works the exact same way. It just was a different way to, to tell the performer what chords to improvise off of. So they were literally thinking about these intervals above a given bass note, and then they would know what chord to improvise. And then there were manuals that talked about, different patterns and embellishments that you might improvise based on the figured bass numbers. Okay, but that's an entire practice of an improvisation from the Baroque period that we borrow today, the figured bass numbers from to define the inversion of a chord. Okay. We'll stop there in terms of just understanding the inversions, but now we'll start part writing those chords on the next video.